Well, hello. I am Dr. Alan Pietrobon, an assistant professor of global affairs at Trinity Washington University. And it just so happens my area of specialty is nuclear weapons and U.S. foreign policy. And today, of course, we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, looking back on its 60th anniversary. And I want to open by saying, first of all, I did not plan it this way. This talk on the missile crisis was scheduled months ago to coincide with this anniversary, and I didn't plan it to coincide with headlines. Well, hello. We've seen
I am
just
Dr.
a few
Alan
days
Pietrobon,
ago talking about the
professor
very
of global
real
affairs
threat
at Trinity
of
Washington
nuclear war
University.
right now. And it just so happens my area of
annexation of
specialty
Ukraine.
is nuclear weapons
I didn't
and
plan
U.S.
to talk
foreign
about the
policy.
Cuban Missile Crisis
As
as
today,
a
of course,
study
we're going
in
to talk about
crisis
the
decision-making,
Cuban Missile Crisis,
where
looking
we
back
might
on
be
its
nearing
60th
another
anniversary.
point of nuclear crisis
And I want to
decision-making.
open
And we're
by
seeing
saying,
headlines all
first
over
of all,
about how we should
I did
look
not
to the
plan
Cuban
it
Missile
this way.
Crisis to figure
This
out
talk
what
on the
to
missile
do
crisis
with
was scheduled
today's
months
crisis.
ago to
About
coincide
how
with this
apparently President
anniversary,
Biden himself
and I
is
didn't
looking
plan
to the
it
lessons
to coincide
from the missile
with
crisis.
headlines.
Well, hello.
This
We've
is
I
meant
am
just
Dr.
a few
Alan
days ago,
Pietrobon,
talking
assistant
about the
professor of
very
global
real
affairs
threat
at Trinity
dangerous
Washington
nuclear war
University
right
in
now.
world
And it
after
just so
Russia's
happens my area of
annexation of
specialty
Ukraine.
is
And it might
nuclear
seem
weapons
I didn't
and
plan
U.S.
to talk about the
foreign
Cuban Missile
policy.
Crisis as
Today,
a
of course,
study
we're going
in
to talk about
crisis
the
decision-making,
missile crisis,
where
looking back on its
nearing
60th
another point
anniversary.
of nuclear crisis.
And I want to open
but it does
by
seeing
saying,
headlines all over
first of all,
about how we
I
should
did not
lessons
plan
to the
it.
Cuban Missile Crisis
From
from
historical
this talk on the
events.
missile
I
crisis
didn't
was
think
scheduled
so.
months ago
wouldn't have
about
chosen
how
to become a
apparently
professional
President Biden
historian.
himself
And I
is
didn't
looking
plan
to the
it
lessons
to
but I
coincide
also
the missile
am
crisis.
worried
Headline.
Well, hello.
That we're
I
learning
am
just a
Dr.
few
Alan
days ago
Pietrobon,
from talking
assistant
about the
professor
very
of global
real
affairs
threat
at Trinity
dangerous
Washington
nuclear war
University
right
in
now.
world
And it
after
just so
Russia's
happens my area of
annexation
specialty
Ukraine.
is
And it might
nuclear
seem
weapons.
I didn't so I
and
think we are
U.S.
talking about
foreign
one of those
policy.
rhyming moments where
Study
study
and
talk about
crisis
this, though I didn't
decision-making
plan
where
this to
back
coincide
on its
nearing
60th
another
anniversary.
point of nuclear crisis.
And I want to open,
but it does
by
seem
saying
headlines all
to
over
explore
about
the
how
Cuban
there
Missile
are
Crisis.
lessons
plan
to
to
learn
learn
about it
from
from
its
in this talk on the missile
crisis
crisis
was
was
scheduled
scheduled
months
months
ago
ago
about
about how
apparently
President
President
Biden
Biden
himself
and I
is
didn't
looking
plan
to
it
lessons
to
but I
coincide
also
the missile
am
crisis.
worried
Headline.
Well, hello.
That we're
I
learning
am
just a
Dr.
few
Alan
days ago
Pietrobon,
from talking
assistant
about the
professor
very
of
real
global affairs
threat
at Trinity
dangerous
Washington
nuclear war
University
right
in
now.
world
And it
after
just so
Russia's
happens my area of
annexation
specialty
But I also
is
think
and it might
nuclear
seem
weapons.
people
So I think we are
just
talking about
really
one of those
shallow
rhyming
as
moments
a
where study
study
talk
so I'd like to
about
do
I
a
didn't
thing
plan
for
this to
back
coincide
on its
nearing
60th
another
anniversary.
point of nuclear crisis.
And I want to open
but it does
by
so
saying
often
headlines
when
all
the
over
explore
about
the
how
Cuban
I
Missile
did
Crisis
not
focus
plan
learn
to
about
learn
it
from
from
its
those
this talk on the missile
13
crisis
days
scheduled
ago
months ago
about
how
how
apparently
President
Biden
Biden
himself
and I
didn't
didn't
plan it
set
to
to
coincide with the
and I
missile
want to
crisis.
well, hello.
I am
just
especially
a
today's
logical
talking
trend
about the fact that we're
learning
learning
here
today
that
right
countries
and it just so happens my area of specialty
but I also
is,
think
and it might
what I'd like to explore
we
we
are
are
talking
talking
about
about
one
one
of
of
those
those
rhyming
rhyming
moments
moments
study
so I'd like to do a
what
quick
thing
trends
where
where
back on
on
birthing
another
this
point
is
nuclear crisis
and I want to open
and then we'll
say
say
headlines all
explore
over
the
explore
the
focus
just on
when it's
those
this talk on the missile crisis
13
days
days
ago
ago
months ago
about
how
I would
apparently
are
said
said
by story
and
I
I
didn't plan it
set
to
to
coincide
coincide
and I want to talk about
well, hello.
I am
that
just
especially
a
logical
talking about the fact that we're learning and it just so happens my area of
but I also
specialty is, and it might
what I'd like to explain is talk about the U.S. spy plane study before the missile
on it this is
13 day long
and I want to open
and then we'll
say headlines all over
annihilate
when it's this talk on the missile crisis
of course I would hope we are said by stories set to coincide and I wonder does the United States one
I am
that especially ideological ties to that
and it just so happens military
but I also
and it might what I'd like to explain is talk about the U.S. spy plane burn this terrifying and why and then we'll say headlines all over annihilate this talk on the missile crisis that United States
Soviet himself. I am
intercontinental ballistic missile flying 32 minutes from Russia, or a medium-range missile flying 8 minutes from Cuba, it didn't matter. You couldn't stop them either way, and you were dead at the end of the day. So the overall situation didn't change. It didn't change the balance of where these missiles were being launched from. So who cares? But Kennedy grappled with the larger implications and told his advisors, quote, "Do you realize that if I make a mistake in this crisis, 200 million people are going to get killed?" End quote. But ultimately, as the story goes, it was Kennedy's tough resolve not to bend in the face of an aggressive adversary that won the day. Maybe the general public finally might remember that famous line from Secretary of State Dean Rusk during the height of the crisis, when Khrushchev finally backed off and turned his ships around, upon which Rusk said, quote, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." This story about the crisis, this story that's the subject of the famous book and movie 13 Days, a clip of which you're watching right now, gives the threat of nuclear war this Hollywood sheen, makes it this moment tense and thrilling, where astute men in their well-tailored suits with smoldering cigarettes hanging out of their mouths, they hold the fate of the world in the balance. These shots are exchanged in action sequences, but ultimately, cooler heads prevail. Except, in reality, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who was brought in to help with the decision, later said that nuclear war was avoided due to, and I'm quoting him, "plain dumb luck." And that's the crux of it. The successful resolution of the worst crisis the world had ever seen was not the product of reasoned decision-making. It was luck. Plain dumb luck. The reason both leaders decided to pull back at the end of the day was because on the most dangerous day of the crisis, which we'll talk about in a moment, they realized that events were spiraling in a way that they could no longer control. That despite being the commanders and chiefs of their armed forces, this crisis had taken on a life of its own, and the president and premier of the Soviet Union were no longer in the driver's seat. And part of the reason we have this skewed view of the crisis as being a success is because for decades after the crisis, really the only detailed accounts we had of the decision-making from inside the White House were from the people involved. Mainly notes that Robert Kennedy had took that were discovered after he died in 1968. And they were ultimately published posthumously as the book 13 Days, the seminal memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, Robert paints a very rosy picture of the thoughtful decisions that they were making. Even other Kennedy advisors like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said JFK, and I'm quoting from him here, quote, "His combination of toughness and restraint, of will, nerve, and wisdom, so brilliantly controlled, so matchlessly calibrated, dazzled the world," end quote. And for decades, we had to rely on the words of the people directly involved to tell their own story. And they are not reliable witnesses, unfortunately, as it turned out, because it's not until 1997, the late 80s to mid 90s, when actual records and transcripts and the audio recordings of those meetings were released, and scholars were shocked at how reckless some of the members of the XCOM were, shocked at how confident the Joint Chiefs of Staff were that we could bomb the Soviet missile sites and suffer few consequences. The fact is, we came much, much closer to total destruction than people knew at the time. And the evidence also showed that though the Kennedy administration thought it was acting on solid intelligence, they actually, we now know, knew almost nothing about what was really going on the ground in Cuba. They thought we could bomb the missile sites before they were completed and operational, but many were already active. They thought we could launch a ground invasion of Cuba to wipe up the remnants, but the Soviets had quadruple the number of troops on the island than our intelligence estimates said. A US ground invasion would have been a bloodbath. And most terrifyingly of all, the US had no idea that the Soviets also had deployed small tactical nuclear weapons prepared for use against invading American Marines. They likely would have nuked us on the beach. We also had no idea that the Soviet submarines that we were trying to force to the surface were also carrying nuclear torpedoes, one of which was nearly detonated, but for one sailor aboard who refused to launch. And so with that by means of introduction, to understand where all of this began, I first want to take us back to the mid-1950s. A time where, to be clear, if you were an average middle-class white American family, this was a time of near unbridled affluence for many. This was the very pinnacle of the American golden age of middle-class families where a man could be confident that he could almost certainly work the same job his entire career if he wanted to. He'd get frequent raises and promotions. He'd make enough money that his wife could typically stay home and raise the kids, where the family could afford to buy a house off in the suburbs and pay off the mortgage in full in an average of just 7 years. That stat makes me annoyed compared to 30 years today. The United States, the point being, was at the very peak of its power, its influence, its wealth, and its international respect. But despite all this wealth, all this abundance, all this happy-go-lucky life of suburban bliss and diners and drive-thrus and cars with big tail fins, there was a dark shadow looming over the country. And that shadow was nuclear weapons. In a 1955 survey, it showed that the majority of Americans listed the possibility of nuclear war with Russia as the nation's number one problem. Number one problem. I mean, consider that the Soviets had only gotten a nuclear bomb of their own just 6 years earlier. And this anxiety among American citizens wasn't helped by US propaganda films like this one, a clip I want to show you here.
You are the target of those who would trample the liberties of free men. You are in the crosshairs of the bomb sight. An enemy is centering on you. You are a citizen of the free world, a citizen of the United States of America. You may live in an industrial city. You are the target. Our president has told us that even against the most powerful defense, an aggressor in possession of an effective number of atomic bombs could cause hideous damage. Today, in the age of hydrogen weapons, evacuation from target areas is our best assurance of survival. You and your family must protect yourselves. Wherever you are, take cover.
Depending on your age, some of you may remember the duck and cover drills at school or backyard bomb shelters. In the United States, through the 1950s into the 60s, there was a whipping up of constant fear of nuclear attack by those evil Soviets who were trying to take over the world. But in the 1950s, at that time, an actual nuclear attack would have meant huge, slow, lumbering bombers coming over the Arctic Circle, where the US would typically get a number of hours of warning and have a chance to intercept these Russian bombers and shoot them down. And so in the face of that type of attack with ample warning, the solution was either to retreat into your bomb shelter, or better yet, get in your car and evacuate a city that would be the target. You typically have about 6 hours. Again, I'll show you a short clip of a propaganda film from the time explaining this evacuation system.
But this city is preparing in the only known way to prevent mass death, by planned withdrawal from the city. At St. Paul's School, Dennis Lapierre, 8 years old, and Roseanne, 6, head for home by the most direct route. Civil defense authorities believe that where possible, families should leave the city together, so the instructions to all are head for home. George Lapierre locks the door of his engineering shop. Like everyone else in Sector B3, he knows exactly what to do. He will use his car for the withdrawal. That was decided in the Census of Transportation. Private cars will be the escape vehicles in this exercise, but in a real emergency, trains, taxis, and buses also would be used. For those who don't go...
Evacuate the city and everyone will be safe. But then, on October 5th, 1957, the world changed. The Soviet Union came out of nowhere and shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the very first satellite into outer space. The Soviets won. They got a rocket into space first. And this moment was especially embarrassing to the United States because the US had been endlessly boasting about how it would be the first into space, that the Soviets weren't nearly advanced enough to get there. And while this moment was a huge technological achievement for humanity, this should have been a cause for celebration, but instead, it was a huge cause of fear in the United States. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was named Man of the Year in 1957 because of this achievement. And this caused enormous fear in the US because it, quote unquote, proved that the Americans were falling behind, that the Soviets were more advanced than us. They were on the move. In fact, a New York Times headline 2 days later said, quote, "The day Sputnik orbited the Earth, the United States became a second-rate power," end quote. People freaked out over Sputnik and demanded that the US government do something. President Eisenhower said that if the USSR had become the first to achieve superior military capability in outer space, that would pose a direct threat to the United States, a direct military threat. And that last point is the crux of it, because you can use a space rocket to launch a satellite for peaceful purposes, but you can also put a nuclear warhead on that same rocket and launch it around the world. Now, the United States doesn't get 6 hours of warning with planes that you can potentially shoot down. The flight time of an intercontinental ballistic missile launched from Russia is about 32 minutes, and there is no way to stop it. Ballistic missiles travel far too quickly to be shot down. We're talking even today, we've been looking at anti-ballistic missile defense systems that still don't work. And so, partly to correct this perceived imbalance of nuclear power, in response to Sputnik, President Eisenhower ordered US Jupiter nuclear missiles deployed to the allied nation of Turkey. Jupiters were medium-range missiles that could fly about 1,500 miles, but they were placed just 130 miles from the Soviet border. On this image, this little map here, the red line is a Soviet border, and the US missiles were placed right here. You can see me circling there in Turkey. A missile launched from Turkey could hit its target in the Soviet Union in just minutes with basically no warning. And the perceived target of these missiles is Nikita Khrushchev's vacation home, right there on the shore of the Black Sea. Khrushchev sees Americans placing nuclear missiles just 130 miles from his border as a massive and aggressive and, most importantly, unnecessary provocation. Khrushchev's son, Sergei, would later say that those missiles in Turkey really, really bothered him. And it's those missiles in Turkey that give Khrushchev the idea to place nuclear missiles in Cuba just a few years later. He would say to his advisors at that time, quote, "Those missiles scare us, but now we're going to give them back some of their own medicine. The Americans surrounded us with military bases and kept us at gunpoint. The Americans would now share the experience of being under the nuclear gun," end quote. And so the aftermath of that Sputnik moment greatly accelerates the arms race. The US increases its spending, it deploys nuclear missiles around the world. And granted, the Soviet leader too says that his country is churning out nuclear missiles just like they make sausages. And I want to pause for a moment to talk about this guy, Nikita Khrushchev, the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union since 1956, and the biggest thorn in Khrushchev's side throughout his years as Soviet premier, he would rule up to 1964, was that the United States didn't respect the Soviet Union. It didn't recognize the Soviet Union as an equal superpower. Khrushchev would lecture the United States about the need to treat the Soviets as an equal. But Khrushchev, the thing Americans didn't often know, genuinely wanted to end the Cold War arms race and make peace with the United States. He thought it was a waste to spend such massive sums of money on this Cold War arms race to build tanks and missiles just to keep up. He wanted to use that money instead to improve the standard of living for his own people. And so he based a lot of his approach to the United States on what he called peaceful coexistence. That, sure, we disagree on the best way to run a society, the best political and economic structures, but there's no reason we can't peacefully coexist. We don't need to be in a Cold War arms race over this. But the image of Khrushchev as a man of peace wanting to end the Cold War is not the image the American people had of Khrushchev at the time. He was the supervillain in the collective minds of Americans. He was this fat, short, bald man of peasant roots who had a penchant for using crude phrases. And Khrushchev was perhaps most famous for his furious temper. And what scared the United States most of all was that a man who had such a short fuse was in control of such a vast and deadly nuclear arsenal. Under President Eisenhower, the US State Department had concluded that Khrushchev was the most dangerous person to lead the Soviet Union since the October Revolution. Rather than portraying him as an intelligent, calculating person, the State Department reports depicted him as emotional and, quote, obviously intoxicated most of the time, end quote, which was totally untrue. They informed the president that Khrushchev could, quote, be expected to commit irrational acts, end quote. But none of that was entirely accurate. Those who knew Khrushchev personally note his somewhat surprising intelligence, given his upbringing in Ukraine with little formal education. They note that he was gregarious and kind and witty, incredibly intelligent, could be very compassionate. In fact, Khrushchev's gravestone in Russia is cast in half black and half white to portray these two clashing sides, the public side of Khrushchev, the crazy menace, and the private side of Khrushchev, the intelligent, compassionate man. But in the United States, because of our Cold War propaganda efforts to discredit Khrushchev and the Soviet Union in general, there are basically two public images the US knows about Khrushchev, the American people, that is, if they know anything at all. These 2 points. Number one, Nikita Khrushchev once told the United States he will bury you, which was interpreted as a nuclear threat. Except that's not what he said. That was a mistranslation that the American press picked up and publicized widely as proof that Khrushchev was dangerous and wanted nuclear war. Khrushchev himself would later say, like, what are you talking about? That's not what I said. And the second thing that Americans knew Nikita Khrushchev for was that at the United Nations, he took off his shoe and banged it on the desk, which again, all the major newspapers reported on breathlessly as evidence of his craziness. The problem with that story is, according to scholars, there's actually zero photographic or video evidence that that ever happened. And those who were there dispute that the story is true, that the whole episode could be what we might today call fake news, just propaganda meant to make Khrushchev look bad. Look, my point here is that Americans at the time viewed Nikita Khrushchev as this reckless, aggressive man who wouldn't hesitate to use nuclear weapons against the United States. But in reality, that wasn't an entirely fair picture of him. And the flip side is, in January 1961, a young, inexperienced new president enters the White House. And today, we sort of have this image of Kennedy as a man of peace, an inspiring president who was trying to end the Cold War. But that, too, is not entirely a fair picture of him. That's the heroic myth created after he died. But during his election campaign that year, Kennedy positioned himself as an aggressive and militaristic Cold Warrior who made the cornerstone of his election campaign out of attacking Republicans and General Eisenhower himself, war hero of World War II, for not being aggressive enough towards the Soviet Union. He charged that under Eisenhower, the US had fallen behind in nuclear missiles. He talked constantly about a nuclear missile gap. Except, unfortunately, like many politicians on the campaign trail, Kennedy was blatantly and knowingly lying about this. Presidential candidates get the same intelligence briefings that the president gets, and so he knew that there was a nuclear missile gap, but it greatly favored the United States in 1961. But the American people believed his claims because it seemed true, right? The Soviets had beat us into space, and the only images we ever saw of them was of them parading their nuclear missiles around. The only press Khrushchev got was when he boasted about how powerful his country was. Here's the point. Even after he was elected, in order to prove his toughness, as part of his inaugural parade, John F. Kennedy had a fleet of military vehicles carrying US nuclear missiles parading down Pennsylvania Avenue. If we viewed this objectively, the United States is acting just like the Soviet Union. This can easily be perceived by any outside viewer as super aggressive, a new president parading missiles down Pennsylvania Avenue. And then, just months after Kennedy takes office, in April, the US launches the ill-fated Bay of Pigs operation in order to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro, who had taken over the country a few years earlier. You probably, if you know this story too, know how it went. It was a total fiasco. The Cuban forces routed the CIA-backed invasion force and made the United States look like hypocritical fools. And what it proved to the world in this moment was that the United States was willing to, without justification, invade a sovereign nation. And this convinced the Cubans and the Soviets that the US would almost certainly regroup and try again. In fact, historian Sheldon Stern concludes that, quote, John F. Kennedy and his administration, without question, bore a substantial share of the responsibility for the onset of the Cuban Missile Crisis, end quote. The Kennedy administration had misled the American people about the fact that the USA was far more powerful than the Soviet was, that it had concealed the campaign of threats and assassination plots and sabotage intended to overthrow the government in Cuba. And then even after the Bay of Pigs tried to cover it up and claim the US wasn't involved in that. Of course, the Cubans and the Soviets well know what's going on. It's certain that Fidel Castro knew what was going on, a man who was a Cuban nationalist when he led the revolution to overthrow the US-backed previous government. In fact, ironically, when Fidel Castro first appealed to the Soviet Union for help, Khrushchev mused about why his country should help Castro. Castro wasn't a communist, but this American aggression pushed him closer and closer into the Soviet world. And the Bay of Pigs sparked an idea in Nikita Khrushchev's mind. Not only would it boost his standing among his communist allies to provide aid to a small country being directly attacked by the aggressive imperialist Americans, but he could also reset the nuclear balance that the Americans had unbalanced by placing their missiles in Turkey, just 130 miles from the Soviet border. Khrushchev would place his nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American border. To Khrushchev and Castro, this was a brilliant plan. This would protect Cuba, it would establish a Soviet military presence in the Western Hemisphere, and it would solidify his reputation as a bold leader who protected small countries under threat. And so, beginning in July 1962, just over a year after the Bay of Pigs incident, 82 Soviet ships set off on the near 1,400-mile round trip, transporting supplies and soldiers and nuclear missiles. This was a massive operation, the largest secret deployment of nuclear weapons in history. But because the standard story of the Cuban Missile Crisis rightly focuses on the nuclear missile sites themselves, we miss half the story. This initiative was much larger than just Soviets building some missile sites. You need huge amounts of construction equipment. Those ships transporting the Soviet equipment and missiles, they need armed submarines to shadow and protect them. The missile sites on the island, they need troops to build and then guard and then operate them. And those military troops need equipment and tanks and artillery and planes and anti-aircraft guns and anti-ship missiles to fire at sea at an potential attacking US Navy. And so pretty soon, Khrushchev's decision to place a handful of missile sites in Cuba actually turns Cuba into a massive and formidable Soviet military base right on US shores. It's important not to forget that there's more than just nuclear missiles going on here. And despite this new and enormous amount of Soviet activity, this was almost the most serious American intelligence failure of the entire Cold War. The United States had been flying spy plane flights over the island, but they had largely failed to pick up anything out of the ordinary. Just one more week of cloud cover where you can't take pictures, and those missiles would have been completed and operational. And at that point, there was little the United States would be able to do about it. Once the Soviets had the ability to fire those missiles, the US can't bomb them. Because if you aren't 100% successful in your bombing run, you're going to have a surviving nuclear missile launched back at you. And the thing is, Khrushchev, much was made of the fact that these were secretly built. This was a huge covert operation. The Soviets were trying to cover it up. But Khrushchev never intended to keep the missiles a secret. He was waiting for them to be operational so they couldn't be bombed, and then he was going to announce it to the world. just like the Americans had in Turkey. And Khrushchev would later talk about how surprised he was that the Americans reacted so violently to the discovery of these missiles. Because the problem is, it's now September 1962, a midterm election year. Democrats hold both houses, but they are battling some public political or some domestic political criticism. And Kennedy, trying to placate his critics that he's being too weak on Cuba, he said at one point, quote, "If at any time the communist buildup in Cuba were to endanger or interfere with our security in any way, then this country will do whatever must be done to protect its own security." End quote. He said that a month before the missiles were discovered. And with that, Kennedy completely backed himself into a corner, and it would come back to haunt him. He would later say that he wished he hadn't said anything about Cuba, or better yet, that he had said he didn't care what happened on the island. Because 1 month later, on October 16th at 9 a.m., President Kennedy was briefed on these shocking spy photos. And astonishingly, the White House managed to keep this a secret for the next 6 days. They wanted to buy time to figure out what to do because these options presented to Kennedy were not ideal. Option 1, pursue diplomacy. Option 2, establish a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent them from shipping in any more supplies. A naval blockade is a literal act of war. 3, destroy the missiles with immediate airstrikes, but there is no guarantee that you'll get all of them. Number 4, destroy the missiles with an immediate airstrike, followed up by a ground invasion to ensure that they've got everything, and then ultimately to overthrow Castro and take over Cuba and secure it. And Kennedy, in those first few days, sides with military action, asks for an air attack package to be prepared, as well as preparations for a ground invasion, which will take about 10 days to prepare. Then, on October 22nd, Kennedy announces to the world the discovery of these missiles.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
What the United States did not know at that time was that the Soviets were so consumed with fear that Kennedy was actually going to announce military action during that primetime address that Khrushchev and his advisors seriously considered launching a nuclear first strike against the US first to head off any attack. Terrifying moment. Luckily, they didn't. But in America, this announcement caused widespread panic as people cleared out grocery store shelves, thinking that there would be a global war. They fled major cities to get out of the expected target zones. And fascinatingly, I actually, as an aside here, got a chance to speak once to Sergei Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev's son, who explained, who at the time, I should add, was a young man living in Moscow. And he explained that the Soviet people were told that the Cuban Missile Crisis is going on. They knew the gravity of the situation. The government didn't try to hide this, but there wasn't really a reaction. And the way he explained it was the Russian people had lived for so long under the threat of an American nuclear attack that this didn't change anything. This was just like normal course of events. But this crisis in America was a psychological crisis more than anything. Americans didn't have to grapple with the fact until that moment that they too might get attacked. There's a threat in the same sense that the Americans had been threatening the Soviets with for 10 years earlier. And I don't want to get into the blow-by-blow, minute-by-minute details of what happened after the crisis erupted. That story's been well tread. But just to say, after Kennedy's announcement that he was instituting a naval quarantine, he avoided the use of the word blockade, which is an act of war. Khrushchev was furious. this was an illegal, in his perspective, outrageous act of war. Khrushchev wrote JFK 2 days later, where he said, quote, "It is outright banditry, the folly of degenerate imperialism, and an act of aggression that pushes mankind towards the abyss of world nuclear missile war," end quote. And just as Kennedy had considered airstrikes immediately before pulling back, Khrushchev first considered ordering a Soviet ship to run the blockade and dare the Americans to sink it, let them take the first shot. The United States deployed an absolute armada of ships to Cuba, 63 vessels on a line stretching 500 miles. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were mobilized and assembled in Florida to prepare for that ground invasion. Coastal defenses were set up on the beaches of Key West, Florida. Here's a picture of an anti-aircraft installation on a white sandy beach in Florida. Here's a man, again, on a beautiful vacation beach, digging a machine gun nest in expectation of retaliatory attacks. There was a massive US military response. And tensions ratcheted up for the first 4 days of the crisis when Kennedy was still intent on bombing, and there seemed to be no other viable resolution. But then things started to turn. Fidel Castro is enraged. He is certain an American attack will come at any moment. He'd already ordered a general mobilization of his Cuban troops. To Castro, there is no hope for a peaceful resolution. And just 4 days into the crisis, he writes a letter to Khrushchev urging him to launch a nuclear first strike against the United States. Take them out while we still have the chance. And so maybe, in an odd sort of way, Castro should get some credit for ending the crisis, because that letter scares Khrushchev. Castro has a death wish. And for all of Khrushchev's faults and his reckless gamble in placing these nuclear missiles in the first place, he does not want war. That was never his intention here. But he's afraid now that maybe Castro is the wild card that he can't control anymore. And so that same day, Khrushchev sends a letter to JFK imploring him to help him de-escalate this crisis. Khrushchev feels like he's losing control. He doesn't have a handle on what Castro might do. And Khrushchev's instincts were right. During the crisis, the United States continued to fly surveillance flights over the island in order to get basically better targeting information for their planned bombing runs. And defying Khrushchev, Castro had ordered his anti-aircraft batteries to shoot down any American aircraft trying to overfly the island. The very next day, an American plane was shot down, but actually by a Soviet missile battery. Its pilot was killed. Khrushchev had not given the order to fire. It was just some local commander on the ground who acted on his own. And now Khrushchev realizes he had lost control. That same day, a Soviet submarine being forced to surface by a US destroyer thought it was under attack, that World War III had already begun, and its captain ordered that their nuclear torpedoes be loaded. Quote, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all," end quote. But Soviet protocol required that to use a nuclear weapon, 3 officers aboard the sub had to agree to launch it. 2 said yes. 1 said no. And that man literally saved the world, prevented what would have become a global nuclear war. The Americans did not know that these Soviet subs were carrying nuclear torpedoes. And so Kennedy and Khrushchev, widely on this day, considered that this was, rather, Khrushchev on this day, which is considered the most dangerous day of the crisis, they both realized that they had lost control of the situation, that any moment something would go off the rails without their orders. The very next day, Khrushchev agrees to pull his missiles from Cuba in exchange for the US pulling their missiles from Turkey, a pledge to never invade Cuba, and other things are part of this deal we can talk about during the question period too. And as I wrap up, the point I'm trying to stress here is that this isn't a story, or at least we shouldn't be telling it as a story of the US winning the Cuban Missile Crisis because of some smart, considered action it took, or because it was, as often is the case, or often how it's explained, it was Kennedy's toughness that caused Khrushchev to back down. What instead happened, and this is what UN American ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, told Kennedy, that he should consider, quote, blackmail and intimidation never, negotiation and sanity always, end quote. Ultimately, what won the day was that Khrushchev especially, and to a lesser extent Kennedy, came to realize that even if you command a massively powerful military force, even if you think nuclear weapons make your country strong and formidable, when it comes down to it, when you play with nuclear fire, when you use weapons of mass destruction to threaten and bully other countries, you've already lost control of the situation. And so I credit Khrushchev for having the intelligence, having the fortitude to step back from the brink before it was too late, to not live up to that false report by the State Department that he was some crazy, reckless gambler who would do anything emotionally. That diplomacy ultimately ended this crisis, as force had proven to be wrong. And as a final note, if you'd like to learn more, there's a fantastic new book out called Gambling with Armageddon that takes this view of the missile crisis from 30,000 feet, exploring the use of nuclear weapons through history. That isn't just this Hollywood story of toughness and tension. These things, like in the missile crisis, can go horribly wrong. These weapons that we claim will keep us safe actually make the world much more dangerous. Thank you for watching. I'm happy to take some questions in a moment here. Okay. Well, it looks like we've got some questions coming in here. Feel free to continue adding them to the box, and we'll get to as many as we can. We've got some good ones, so I don't know where to begin here, but maybe I'll pick up on one of the ideas I talked about that at the beginning, that the US, we now know in hindsight, really didn't have a good handle of what was going on the ground in Cuba at the time. Our intelligence was pretty flawed. And so one of the questions is, there's a lot of misconceptions about what was going on. Is there any truth to the fact that the generals and advisors to Kennedy wanted him to act aggressively, but that Bobby and John Kennedy opposed this aggression? It is certainly true that the Joint Chiefs urged military action at every course. That was one of the shocking things that scholars discovered when the documents became available, is how aggressive the Joint Chiefs were in wanting to pursue strikes, or strikes followed by a full-out ground invasion. And probably the most shocking event, I talked about here how when Castro contacts Khrushchev and orders nuclear first strikes on the US right now, and that really shook Khrushchev and had him pull back. One of the things that really shook President Kennedy is when Secretary of the Air Force, Curtis LeMay, who was well known to be one of the most hawkish people on the Joint Chiefs, was urging immediate strikes, strike the missiles. And Kennedy had made the point, look, we're not just hitting missiles. If we bomb these bases, we're going to kill hundreds of Soviet troops. How do you think the Soviets are going to react to that? And LeMay's response was, they'll do nothing. And Kennedy was taken aback, right? What do you mean the Soviets will just do nothing if we bomb their sites and kill their soldiers? Of course they're going to do something. But it was this sense of superiority, aggression, coming from the military side that really caused Kennedy to rethink this, that if this is the advice I'm getting from my Joint Chiefs, maybe this isn't good advice. But the second part of that question is, it is true that in the first 3 to 4 days, Kennedy actually was on board with strikes. That was his first choice, right? We need to get these out of here. Striking them is about the only way. Pursuing the diplomatic option was seen as too weak, that he would get attacked for this. And so it was only after tensions ratcheted up and things started to get out of control that Kennedy pulled back and started pursuing diplomatic overtures, used the so-called back channel to discuss directly with the Soviet ambassador here. So it is a lot more aggression than we thought at the time. Another question that came in, this is an interesting one, about do we think Kennedy's, quote unquote, success in the Cuban Missile Crisis influenced his decision to send troops to Vietnam? That, I think, no. Partly because the timeline's a bit off here, that Kennedy actually authorized troops before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And by the end of 1962, so after the crisis, there were about 11,000 troops in country, but most of those decisions were made pre-Cuban Missile Crisis. But interestingly, post-Bay of Pigs, they're sort of in that interim. But the thing the Bay of Pigs convinced Kennedy of, and maybe, so if I can take this question and switch it around a little bit, the Bay of Pigs definitely convinced Kennedy not to just blindly trust the military advice he was getting. Interestingly, that's one of the things that former President Eisenhower told Kennedy during one of their meetings. That Eisenhower, war hero, decorated general, told Kennedy, young, inexperienced, with kind of a shifty military record, told him, look, I, a general, have trouble standing up to the Joint Chiefs and their aggression. You need to be really careful about that. And then he didn't stand up to them and their assessment that the Bay of Pigs would be a complete success, that landing these troops would cause the Cuban people to rise up and overthrow Castro, so we don't actually have to do much. That was a fiasco. One of the shocking things. So, it caused him to really think hard about the advice he was getting in the XCOM from the military side of things. But despite the complete failure of the Bay of Pigs, the Joint Chiefs were presenting basically the same plan, that if we do a ground invasion of Cuba, the Cuban people will rise up with us and overthrow Castro. And when I came across that in these documents, it is astonishing, because it didn't work in April of 1961. What makes you think it's going to work now when Castro's even more entrenched, having defeated this American invasion force? So no on the Vietnam, but definitely there's some truth there about him giving more consideration to the type of military advice he was getting. Another, interesting parallel, maybe despite being a historian and trying to keep things in the past, maybe we'll bring it up to the present. There's a question about, Khrushchev, and that it was interesting to learn more about him. Do you think that, the current Russian president, Vladimir Putin, has that sort of control? What's actually interesting is, Russia today, I would argue in some ways, is actually more dictatorial than Russia or the Soviet Union in the 1960s. One of the things Khrushchev would later complain about, actually, to an American journalist who went over shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis and had a one-on-one meeting with him, was that the Americans describe me as a dictator, that I can just bang my fist and get everything I want, that everyone has to bend to my will. And that is not true. That's not how the Soviet system worked. Our understanding of it as a dictatorship, this is not Hitler's Germany. Khrushchev would complain that he had a Politburo, he had a parliament of other members he had to convince and cajole and get them to vote for Khrushchev's initiatives. And certainly he had more power than a current US president. But Khrushchev also dealt with the same problems. There were a number of military hardliners in the Soviet government that were pushing him to act more aggressively. And then there were some doves in the Soviet government that wanted to focus on domestic issues. And ultimately, Khrushchev successfully holding off the military hardliners during the missile crisis is, some argue, what ended up getting him overthrown. What was it? 8 months later, it was, I believe, if I remember the dates correctly, March 1964, sometime in mid 1964. Khrushchev gets overthrown by those hardliners who think that he's too weak, and they oust him. So Khrushchev is not a single-handed dictator in the way that perhaps a character like Putin has a lot more tight control. Khrushchev isn't going around killing his enemies in the way that previous Soviet dictators did, and more modern Russian leaders do too, as we've come to learn. So it is different. We should understand that Khrushchev is in a tight spot here. He has to navigate very, very delicately. One of the other things, someone had referenced a couple of movies from the time period, Testament. I would also reference a 1983 movie called The Day After that dramatizes a Soviet missile strike against the United States that devastates the country. I mean, one of the things we don't have in our sort of collective mindset is what a nuclear strike would have done to the United States. When many Americans think about nuclear weapons, they think, well, we used one. We bombed Hiroshima, and the city was devastated. We've seen all those pictures of it just flattened debris. But Hiroshima today is a thriving metropolis. In fact, it rebuilt relatively quickly. Well, the bombs of 1945 were crude, low-power prototype weapons that could destroy a portion of a city. The nuclear weapons by 1962 are country killers. They are unbelievably, massively powerful. And in a full strike, they strike multiple targets across, hundreds, not multiple, hundreds of targets. The US would have been wiped out. In fact, an assessment from the early 1960s that was presented to Kennedy, that if, I'm trying to remember the numbers here, if the US launched a successful first strike against the Soviets first to wipe out most of their capability, they would still have something left over to retaliate with. So even a retaliatory strike with most of the Soviet capability knocked offline by our first strike would still kill 80 million Americans. The population at the time was 180 million. That would kill half of Americans within a handful of hours. These strikes would have been utterly devastating. And one of the fascinating things to keep on this thread of the movies out there that depict nuclear war is the most iconic movie of all, the 1964 film Dr. Strangelove, which if you haven't seen it, you should. And it's meant to be a satire, a comedy, it's very popular in the US. I did hear from a colleague of mine a fascinating story about how it's 1992, the Soviet Union has collapsed, and this colleague of mine was in Moscow with an exchange among university students where they screened Dr. Strangelove in Moscow for the first time after the Soviet Union collapsed. And in America, we see this as a comedy. It's funny. It's ludicrous satire of nuclear insanity. In Russia, when they screened this, the viewers were angry, were furious at this movie, and had commented to the fact that this just proved to us what we had been told all along, that Americans are warmongers. They are gleeful about nuclear war. How can you laugh at something like this? This isn't comedy. This is tragedy. So the totally different mindset, which really hit home to me, connecting to the point I made in the talk about Sergei Khrushchev talking about how in Russia in 1962, this wasn't really a crisis. They had lived under nuclear threat coming from the United States for years. That in the US and the Western world, this was a psychological crisis over, everything else. And I suppose we have time perhaps for one last question here. And maybe this is a good wrap up on this one I'm looking at. Has the success of the Kennedy presidency been adequately evaluated, given not only the Cuban Missile Crisis, but civil rights, which he was not, in hindsight, maybe as progressive on as many had hoped, the Vietnam escalation. I would say it has been evaluated in that there are, scores of books out there. But one of the things that changes, and the point I made of Kennedy coming in is an aggressive hardliner, militaristic, going to be more aggressive towards the Soviet Union to cover his flank, that he might be too young and weak and naive. But what happens after the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the most astonishing changes in the Cold War is that in just 8 months, the countries go from the brink of nuclear war to 8 months later signing the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first major anti-nuclear treaty between the US and the Soviet Union. They do this 180 because both Kennedy and Khrushchev, terrified by the missile crisis, genuinely and actively look for a way to dial back the arms race and end, in this case, atmospheric nuclear testing, which will be not just good for humanity, will be good for the arms race. It'll slow down the development of new nuclear weapons. And they come to sign this deal by, midsummer 1963, the following year. And Kennedy, apparently going into, now 1963, going into 64 is an election year, he was going to stake his re-election on ending the Cold War, on dialing back tensions. He told his advisors that his most important achievement in office was that limited test ban treaty that they signed. And then he's killed in November 1963. And we end up with Lyndon Johnson and the escalation of Vietnam and the ruining of relations because of that. And shortly after Kennedy is killed, Khrushchev is overthrown. And he's replaced with Leonid Brezhnev, a military hardliner in the Soviet Union, which just things sort of dissolve. And even Sergei Khrushchev, maybe I'll end on this note. I think I mentioned in the talk, I got a chance to speak with him years ago. He ended up, after the Soviet collapse, moving to the United States and teaching at a university here. Sergei told me that his father thought that if Kennedy and Nikita had just a couple more years together in office, they could have ended the Cold War. That this missile crisis was that turning point where they were going to dial things back. But sadly, Kennedy's killed, Khrushchev is ousted, and the Cold War continues for 40 more years. And hopefully we're not in a repeat of this missile crisis, given there's a lot of questions that came in about Russia, Ukraine. I wish you had more time to grapple with some of these. But unfortunately, we are out of time. I appreciate you watching, and I hope to see you again in a future talk. Thanks, everyone.